welcome you this morning as we gather together. To put the record straight, someone likened themselves, as I remember, to Brad Pitt, and then somehow also suggested that we have a statue of Brad Pitt up on the waterfall, the same worship. I'm glad you're here this weekend. This has been quite a week for us. A lot of things. First of all, our executive pastor, Peggy, has been out of town with her grandkids in Oklahoma, and she's coming back tonight, and the building is still standing. So we can do it. But everybody turn to a camera and just say, "Hi, Peggy."
Hi, Peggy.
Yeah. We, last week, generally our fifth Sunday offering, or all the time our fifth Sunday offering, 100% goes to various benevolences, and we did that last week, and I want to thank you. Because Peggy isn't there, I don't have a total for you. We'll have that next week. But we were able to, I know, I think like 5,000 of that was going, 4,800 or something like that was going to Eastgate Community to get those kids to some scholarships to the Bighorn Camp in Montana, and quite a bit is going down to Honduras, and we'll divvy that up and let you know. But I just want to thank you for continuing to support that ministry. It's a lot that we do. Yeah, a lot that we do. Some goes to Grace Clinic, some goes to just all over the place, and it's just really, really proud of all that you've been able to do through those Fifth Sunday offerings. I almost stopped the series we're on right now and went to Lamentations because next week, not because it is Mother's Day, and so we're going to talk about Mother's Day, but there's no correlation there, but we don't have tacos on our second Sunday taco. Usually Jose Tacos comes in on second Sunday because it's Mother's Day. We're going to defer that, so there's no tacos next week. And I'm like ready today, but we'll get there. We also, and then we had our really great day Thursday mobile market. We do a monthly food dispersion over in East Kennewick, and there again, thank you guys so much for your continued support on that. That's been just a fascinating, fabulous experience for us over the last several years. Yeah. So, a big event yesterday in the life of our community. We celebrated the life of our founding pastor, Pastor Dale White, and a lot of you were here, and it was just an amazing experience of community, and for me particularly family. I had a lot of family. Some of them are still here from out of town, and so grateful for all of your support for our community and our family. It's a really, really neat celebration, and I just want to thank those who were here and everyone who worked behind the scenes. We've been going through the book of Ruth, and today we're going to hit chapter 3, and we're going to drill down into it. Ruth has just, at least for myself, it's been a really, really fun but interesting, amazing experience. And I think chapter 3, before we even get to it, I think it's about one of the most difficult passages to really get into and understand in the entire Old Testament. There's so much going on in the middle of the night on this threshing floor. And before we start into it, I have to remind us, Ruth's world is very different than ours today. And it was patriarchal society. We talked about that a couple weeks ago. But the point is, if we assume that, gender roles in Ruth's world are the same that ours, and then we take this material and we try to apply it to these lessons to our world today, male-female relationships, dating and marriage, it's going to be a disaster. I'm just going to let you know. This is not why we're studying this material at all. What do I mean? Well, in Ruth's world, there were a variety of reasons for someone to get married, but romance honestly was not one of them. Marriage was about economy, and it was about security. Marriages were generally arranged. The women had no say in the matter whatsoever. When a husband died, and we're going to deal with this in this passage, when a husband died and left no children, the widow was expected to marry her brother-in-law. Everybody's just say ick. Because that sounds crazy to us, it really does. But Ruth and Naomi, they're a perfect example of why this happened, because we saw last week, Ruth is out gleaning in the fields, trying in the hot sun to take care of herself and her mother-in-law, who's also a widow, because they have no security. Marriage was about economics, and it was about security. The only other option was prostitution. Marrying a deceased husband's brother was their social security system. And it meant a childless widow would be taken care of. So it was partly for the widow's security. But there was another reason that a childless widow was supposed to marry her husband's brother to keep the land and the property in the family was the bigger issue. But that's not all. As important as the family's economic security, it was really about preserving the dead man's legacy. And this is where it really does get out of what we would understand in our worldview today. If there was no heir, a widow was supposed to marry her dead husband's brother, who would impregnate her, and the child would carry on the line of the deceased. And then eventually the child would inherit the property, so it would stay within the family, was the point. So we hear Ruth 3 and we're going to automatically focus on two things, and that's going to be sex and romance. You're going to hear the story in a second. And for us, this is really going to sound like an episode of Desperate Housewives. For the record, I've never seen that, but that is not how people in Ruth's day would have ever heard this story. They would automatically think of three things, and they're going to be critical if we're going to understand what's really going on in this story. They would have automatically thought of three things when they heard the story. The first was security for these two, childless widows. The second was preserving Naomi's dead husband's land, Elimelech. And then the third really would have been continuing his name and his legacy. Understanding how people in Ruth's world would have understood this chapter and heard the story, it's not only going to make this, really, really difficult story make sense, because it is difficult. But I'll tell you, it's going to give us some incredible wisdom and insight into being God's people today. So here's the first 5 verses. Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it might be well with you." Now here's our kinsman Boaz, with whom the young women you've been working with. See, he's winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, go down to the threshing floor. Do not make yourself known to the man until he's finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies, and then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he'll tell you what to do. She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do." Like I said, this is not dating advice for your teenagers. But there's amazing wisdom in this story. So remember, chapter 1, we talked about a couple weeks ago. Naomi, she experienced tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. She's like the female Job of the Old Testament. She was a trauma victim. She was absolutely paralyzed. She lost her husband. She lost her sons in this foreign land of Moab. If you remember, Naomi and her husband Elimelech, they had taken their family away from Bethlehem, their hometown, because there was a famine in the land. And they were there. In 10 years, they were away, and they lost everything. Except for two barren Moabite daughter-in-laws. That's all she left with. Her sons had married them while they were in the land of Moab. And the point was, and we talked about this a lot, Moabites were despised by the Israelites. They were forbidden to marry Moabites. And Deuteronomy 23, 3 and 6 says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any other descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. Not even in the 10th generation. Do not seek a treaty of friendship with them as long as you live. I mean, that's pretty hardcore. All Naomi had to show for those 10 years were 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws. And they had not been able to bear children after 10 years of marriage. When the famine, was over, we remember Naomi talked one of her daughter-in-laws to just stay home. And frankly, I think she wanted both of them because I don't think she wanted to show up in Bethlehem with 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws. It would have been an embarrassment for her, for one thing. But we saw Ruth pledge to never leave Naomi's side. So these 2 widows, Naomi and Ruth, they set out for Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem. So in chapter 1, Naomi, tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, and then you remember she attributed it all to God. She felt God had just given up on her, that God was punishing her. Then in chapter 2, we saw a massive turn where Naomi experienced what we called Hesed in Hebrew, and it's this sacrificial love that just goes beyond anything anybody ever has the right to expect. And then we saw last week that Hesed, that was at the heart of the life that God intended for humans to experience, all the way from the beginning of creation. Hesed is the love that God has for each one of us, but Hesed is also the love that God wants us to share and live to the world, to each other. It's God partnering with people, and it's God working through humans to bring about His kingdom here on earth, as it is in heaven. Somebody's going to talk about that later on. So Ruth chapter 2 was the story of Naomi's experience of God's Hesed through Ruth, but also through this distant relative Boaz that we were introduced to it last year. And he says he's a good man. He's a man of valor. He's a man of stature, a man of wealth and prominence within the community. And he goes way out of his way to help these 2 widows. And that just kind of knocked Naomi out of her depression. So chapter 3. Chapter 3 is going to take Hesed to an entirely new Hesed level on the Hesedometer. But we're going to have to work at it a little bit. And so I want you to stick with me on this, because it is very foreign to our world. So make sure you got the big picture. Chapter 1, Naomi thought God is punishing her with all of this tragedy. Chapter 2, Naomi realized God had not deserted her, and He was actively helping and working to bless her through Ruth and Boaz. Then chapter 3. Even though Naomi is still grieving the loss of her husband and her sons and the life that she had, she realizes how much Ruth has sacrificed for her. Ruth left her homeland of Moab. She left her family. She left her friends. She moved to Bethlehem to take care of Naomi. And all of a sudden she realized, what's going to happen to her? Naomi is concerned about Ruth's future, because someday she's going to be left alone. What's going to happen when Naomi dies? And this barren, widowed Moabite daughter-in-law she has is left alone, a foreigner in a foreign land. She knows if Ruth would have stayed in Moab, Ruth's family would have stepped up and they would have taken care of her. But in Bethlehem, once Naomi's gone, she's on her own. She's all alone. She has no one to look out for her. So Ruth 3:1, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it will be well with you." Ruth had so many strikes against her. I mean, no Israelite would ever consider marrying her just because she was Moabite alone. But she had been married for 10 years before she lost her husband. Absolutely no children whatsoever. Nobody is going to marry a barren, foreign widow from Moab. She's got no dowry. She's poor. This sounds really cold to us today, but this is how they would have heard it. Back then, Ruth would have been seen as a drain on the family's resources. She had nothing to bring to the table whatsoever. She couldn't bear children. That was everything back then, right? And generally, marriages were arranged by men because they were about economy. There was no man in the scene to advocate for Ruth. There was no man to broker a marriage. So Naomi wanted to make sure Ruth would be taken care of. And who's going to take care of a barren Moabite widow? But she's a good woman. She gave up everything for Naomi. But is there going to be a man that's good enough to see that in their world and marry her? Ruth 3:2a. Naomi says, here's our kinsman Boaz, whose young women you have been working with. See, he's winnowing in barley tonight at the threshing floor. So last week, Boaz, we saw a really good man. He had gone beyond anything anybody could ever expect to take care of Ruth. I mean, he showed hesed. And Naomi says he's a kinsman. Boaz is not a brother-in-law who would have been legally bound to marry Ruth. Matter of fact, we're about to find there's actually a closer relative who is much more bound to Ruth than Boaz. And we're going to meet him next week. And he's not really named in Hebrew, but basically in Hebrew, the narrator refers to him as either so-and-so or what's his name? So what's his name should have been the one that would have stepped up to take care of these two widows. I mean, he should have married Ruth. He would have known this to continue Elimelech's line, preserve the family land. If you really understand this chapter and what's going on in the threshing floor, we have to get this. Bethlehem was a very small community. What's his name was family. Naomi would have known about what's his name, but she didn't even bother to tell Ruth about what's his name. I think this is really important, because instead of what's his name, Naomi chose Boaz for Ruth. Now we're going to see, this is going to mean a tremendous amount of sacrifice for Naomi. Skipping what's his name and going, it's an incredible act of hesed if you get the culture. Because Boaz is not the next in line to redeem the situation. We saw it's in Hebrew. He's the redeemer of the land, of the property of Ruth. But at least he's a kinsman. Most likely, Boaz was a distant cousin. We don't know. But Naomi knows that Boaz is a righteous man, is the point. And he's already proven he will set aside tradition for what he believes is God's will. Boaz has already taken great care of them. And maybe Naomi's thinking, and if we can get just the right circumstances, he will end up doing this permanently. So Naomi comes up with a plan to create the right circumstances. And like I said, before we get to that, we have to underscore this. The three main issues that Naomi should have been concerned about: security for herself and for Ruth, because they're both widows; preserving Elimelech's land; and preserving Elimelech's name and his legacy. If those three things were her priority, Naomi would have chosen what's his name. Because he was the one who was obligated. There's two laws behind these concerns, and one comes from Deuteronomy, one comes from Leviticus. They're both in chapter 25 of each. 25, and this is a little long, but it's fascinating. When brothers reside together, and one of them dies and has no son, The wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage, performing the duty of a husband's brother to her, and the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. But if the man has no desire to marry his brother's widow, then his brother's widow shall go to the elders at the gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. This is a shame. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and speak to him. And if he persists, say, I have no desire to marry her. Then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, pull his sandal off his foot, spit in his face. I love that. And declare, this is what is done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. I mean, that's pretty much shame, right? Throughout Israel, his family shall be known as the house of him whose sandal was pulled off. I can just see a statue of Brad Pitt up there without a sandal. Then Leviticus 25, and this is a little bit shorter. If any of your kin falls into difficulty, which is what happened, and sells a piece of property, then the next of kin shall come and redeem what the relative has sold. In other words, they're supposed to buy it back. So I hope you hear, the heart of both of these laws were about ensuring the dead man's property, his name, his legacy continues. Now, a side benefit of all of that would have been the widow would have been taken care of. But that was not the intent, because this is a patriarchal society. But following these laws would have come at a cost for the man. Not only did he have to pay money to buy the property, but the pie of his son's inheritance would have been divided among more heirs if this widow would have had children. And his kids would not end up with this land in the long run. So Naomi knew, what's his name, is never going to sacrifice that much for a Moabite widow. So she gave up, and this is huge. She sacrificed, she gave up, even thinking we're going to try to keep the land in the family. She gave up her late husband's legacy, trying to redeem it. And she decided all that matters is that Ruth will have security. Naomi is willing to give it all away as long as Ruth is okay. This is profound. Willing to let her dead husband's name be forgotten. She's willing to let her family land go. Now, we have to understand this in terms of their world, not ours. Because it's unthinkable, but it's Hesed. Hesed is radical, sacrificial love that is only concerned about the other. It's a love that goes above and beyond anything that can be expected of anybody. It's beyond anything anybody has a right to ask. And this is a foreshadow of the love that their descendant named Jesus is going to show on the cross generations later. Hesed is Jesus' heritage. Hesed is Jesus' legacy. So chapter 2, Naomi was the subject of Hesed through her daughter-in-law Ruth, gave up everything to take care of her mother-in-law. Now Naomi has set aside everything to show Hesed to Ruth. Naomi's going to leave family land, the husband's name, the husband's legacy on the table, just walk away from it to ensure Ruth's safety. That's what's going on here. And she tells her, Boaz is a kinsman. He's a good man. He'll do the right thing. He's going to take care of you. We just need to give him a little push here, a little nudge. We have to get security at any cost. So she tells her what to do. Clean up, wait until the party, watch where he falls asleep, uncover his feet, lie next to him, don't say anything, he'll tell you what to do. We hear Naomi's instructions to Ruth, and we just think, this is crazy, right? But in their world, maybe not so much. Boaz has taken care of these two widows well beyond anything he needed to do. And Naomi knows he's a good man. And she knows how many strikes are against Ruth in their world. So somehow Naomi needed to come up with a way for Boaz to see Ruth not as a barren Moabite widow, but as a potential wife. And the first thing she tells Ruth, you need to change your clothes. And what's that? Well, most likely she's still wearing, the clothes of a widow who has been mourning the loss of her husband. And this change, it's a change of status is the point. She's leaving behind being a mourning widow. Now she's a potential spouse. But how can she get Ruth close enough to Boaz so they can talk without all the town gossip seeing and messing everything up? Well, this night rendezvous is dangerous, but it's a brilliant strategy. The harvest is over. The threshing wheat, barley, was a lot of work, and it took a long time. And so they would work all day, and then they would frankly party like crazy, and then they would sleep there so they could start first thing in the morning. But this was work that they celebrated, especially this time, because if you remember, the reason the family moved to Bethlehem in the first place was there was a famine. They haven't been able to do this for 10 years. This is the first harvest they've had. And so, that first night, they're partying like it's 1999. So remember the reason, like I say, the threshing hole, that they processed all of this grain at the end of the harvest, and they really did. It was known for wild behavior at night. And that could be very dangerous for a woman like Ruth if she came across the wrong man in the middle of the night. And so Naomi knows this. And so she says, after everybody's asleep, you watch where he is, and you make your way to Boaz, because he's going to be alone, because he's the leader and he's the owner of the whole thing. So Ruth 3, 6 through 11, she went down to the threshing floor, did just as her mother-in-law instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And I love this. She came stealthily. Now, there's a lot packed in that Hebrew word stealthily, if you remember. We don't have time to get there's good stuff on this one. But uncovered his feet, lay down, and at midnight the man was startled and turned over. And there, lying at his feet, was a woman. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin." And he said, "May you be blessed, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. Now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask. For all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman." So Naomi had the perfect strategy. She knew Boaz was going to do the right thing. He was going to come through. She knew he would take care of Ruth. He just needed a little help. She planned everything out, but there was one variable that she did not account for, and that was Ruth. Because she changed the plan. She wasn't supposed to say a word. She was just supposed to let nature take its course. There are so many innuendos in this passage in Hebrew. I mean, it's crazy. There's double meanings going on like crazy. We're meant to hear this scene in the threshing floor, which was all about, grain and fertility. It is completely sexually charged. To the point, in Hebrew, they stopped calling him Boaz and her Ruth, and they just say the man and the woman over and over and over. And we're supposed to have a picture painted of Adam and Eve becoming one flesh in the garden. But even then, these two are models of integrity is the point. And I think that's part of the point. They'll actually consummate their marriage in chapter 4, and Ruth is very clear about that. But right here, Boaz does not take advantage of her because he is a really good man. He is a righteous man. And Ruth is beyond amazing. So Boaz, his feet are cold. He wakes up. Woman lying next to him. You can hear him. Well, this is going to ruin my reputation. Who are you? Ruth is not supposed to say anything, right? But that's not Ruth. She takes charge. I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you're next of kin. She changes Naomi's plan way more than we realize. Naomi had been willing to give up everything for Ruth's security, but Ruth is showing the same hesed for Naomi here. She's willing to sacrifice everything. In the darkness, on the threshing floor, Ruth invoked the two laws that we read from Deuteronomy and Leviticus when she says, spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. It actually says, spread your wing of protection, which is like all over the Old Testament for God. She says, you are next of kin. You need to redeem my dead father. His land, his name. It is the right thing to do. Do this by marrying me, so I will bear a son. You are a righteous man. You know Deuteronomy 25. You know Leviticus 25. You know the situation. You know the right thing to do. You need to do the right thing. She took the reins like crazy here. In a way their world never would have understood. It was completely unheard of. Last week, Ruth, she forced Boaz to dive deep into God's laws on gleaning, remember? And he raised the bar from what he needed to do to what he realized was the right thing to do. The letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. She's doing the same thing here. Boaz has no legal obligation whatsoever to take care of Ruth. He doesn't need to use his own money or his own estate to purchase this land, redeem it in Hebrew. But Boaz is a good man. He is a righteous man. Ruth is saying to her late father's legacy, his land, his name, it's all going to go away. Everything's going to be lost. Naomi needs security, and she's offering herself as a sacrifice to save her mother-in-law and her family and the legacy and the whole shebang. She is pushing anything that was ever appropriate to request here beyond anything he could have imagined. This is going to cost Boaz way more than anything he ever lost just giving her some extra gleaning privileges last week. He has no obligation. He knows it. She knows it. The letter of the law does not apply to him. But for God's children, it should never be about the letter of the law is the point. It's about the spirit of the law. We're supposed to live life as God intended. Hesed. And Ruth is battling for Naomi. Just like their descendant, all three of them, Jesus, is going to do in the Sermon on the Mount. Ruth is pushing Boaz to follow the spirit of the law. What was God's intent here? You need to do that if you want to be a child of God. So Ruth, this barren Moabite widow, she proposes marriage to Boaz. And for her part, she pledges, after 10 years of no children, to bear a son. This is unheard of. Boaz understands what she's saying. He understands what she's offering. And he's awestruck. And he blesses Ruth. And he praises her for her hesed in Hebrew. I mean, the selfless concern. And then he calls her a woman of valor. That's the same word that was used for Boaz earlier. He was a man of valor, but it's also, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, it's the first line of that poem in Proverbs 31. Normally, it's read a capable wife, if you know the poem. But in Hebrew, it's a woman of valor. Who can find a woman of valor? And I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, but the Old Testament, the Christian Old Testament, called the canon in the order of books that it comes in, has the same books as the Jewish Bible, but so often the rabbis put it in a different order. And one of the things they did intentionally, the rabbis put Proverbs right before Ruth, which is different than the Christian canon, because the last chapter in Proverbs asks, where can you find a woman of valor? And they said, well, let me tell you about Ruth. Boaz rejected the value system of his world. And in the middle of the night on this threshing floor, Boaz is face to face with Hesed. And he makes the right decision. She was no mere Moabite. She's a woman of Yahweh. She is a woman of valor. She is an agent of Hesed for Naomi. And he is going to respond and be an agent of Hesed for Ruth. But there is a hitch, and it's what's his name? Quickly read the rest of the chapter. Now, though it is true I'm near kinsman, Boaz says, there is another kinsman who is more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as the next of kin for you, well and good. Let him do it. If he's not willing to act as next of kin, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie until morning. So she laid at his feet until morning, got up before one person could recognize another, and he said, it must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring your cloak you're wearing and hold it out. And she held it. He measured out 6 measures of barley, about 60 to 80 pounds, maybe 100, and put it on her back, and she went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, how did things go for you, my daughter? And she told her all the man had done, saying, he gave me these 6 measures of barley. Said, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for this man will not rest, but he will settle the matter today. We're going to finish that next week, but I want you to hear. This story is about 3 of Jesus' ancestors. Sacrificial love was deep in his bones, deep in Jesus' DNA through his family story. It was his legacy that he was handed. Naomi, willing to sacrifice her family heritage, her husband's name, her husband's legacy, everything for Ruth. And Ruth was supposed to just nudge Boaz, but Ruth threw that out the window. With an incredible example of sacrificial love of Hesed for Naomi. And then Boaz, who wasn't obligated to do anything, he realized being a man of God means you follow the intent of God's law. You live Hesed. Boaz is a good, righteous man before he met Ruth. But after he and Ruth partner, he becomes amazing. Don't you think as they journey together, each of them becomes greater because of their interactions? Like I said, this is not modeling how, dating is supposed to work. You're not going to tell your teenager to go, find a big party, wait until they fall asleep, then, take somebody's pants off and lay next to them. But this is a lesson on partnering and realizing our relationship should make us better people than we are on our own. It's about living Hesed. These 3 ancestors of Jesus, they're modeling the gospel lived out. This is like a prequel for the gospel, right? Giving ourselves for others. This is our story. This is our legacy. And it's our turn now to run with that baton. We are to model this baton to the next generation so we can pass it on and they can pick it up and carry it. That is how God's kingdom progresses through this world.